A very warm welcome to everybody in this virtual room to this event on the global state of democracy after Biden's first 100 days. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies here at the University of Victoria, and I have the pleasure of being one of the co-moderators for today's session. Before we start off, we would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. Here, when we prepared this session, we thought that the first 100 days of the Biden administration, almost by now 105 days, would be a good moment to review and assess to what degree President Biden has been successful in setting his own agenda and revise some of the legacy of the Trump administration. What the three centers co-organizing this event, the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives, the Center for Studies in Religion, Society, and the Center for Global Studies share in this respect, is a concern for the state of democracy. Over the past years, we have witnessed the growing appeal of nationalism and authoritarianism around the world, and also dramatically witnessed the fragility of liberal democracy as a mode of governance. Without running the risk of overestimating the impact of the Trump presidency, I think it's justified to argue that Trump has been a driving force in feeding these authoritarian tendencies, weakening traditional institutions of democracy, and in the international arena, undermining the authority of multilateralism. What we plan to do today is to assess the legacy of the Trump presidency in this respect, and probably more importantly, looking forward, consider to what degree we see a successful attempt of the Biden administration to restore confidence in American democracy, particularly after the insurrection of January 6th, and to build alliances to support democratic practices and human rights internationally. With these very brief introductory remarks, let me hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Victor Ramraj, the director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives. Over to you, Victor.
Thanks very much, Oliver. So we've structured this webinar around a series of three discussions, three moderated discussions, starting domestically within the United States, shifting outwards to a comparative context, and then shifting to a focus on U.S.-China the U.S.-China relationship, and in particular Hong Kong, through the lens of democracy. So we've asked each of our speakers to prepare an initial response to the three questions we've asked them, after which each of the other two speakers will have a chance to respond, and then we'll shift from one question to the next. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing the speakers, but I am going to introduce them by name and affiliation, and then I will invite each of them to spend 2 to 3 minutes explaining what they bring to the discussion. So in order of in speaking order, let me begin by introducing Amarnath Amarasingam, who is an assistant professor in the School of Religion at Queen's University in Canada. He's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and an associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. Our second speaker is Chris Kilford, who's the president of the Canadian International Council, the Victoria branch, as well as a fellow at the Queen's Center for International and Defense Policy and an adjunct faculty member at Royal Roads University. Our third speaker is Carole Peterson, who's a professor at the William S. Richardson School of Law and the graduate chair in the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And she's also a former director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law at the University of Hong Kong. So may I at this point ask the three speakers to turn on their cameras and in the order that I introduced them, to spend 2 to 3 minutes explaining what they bring to this discussion. So Amar, over to you.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm, as Victor mentioned, assistant professor in the School of Religion and cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's. I've spent about 10 years or so studying different forms of transnational politics, I would say, from kind of the Tamil diaspora politics during the end of the war in 2009 to foreign fighters, which I spent quite a bit of time on from 2013 to about 2019. And now also looking at the transnational connections between different groups in the far right from domestically as well as abroad. And so for me, methodologically, I usually try to talk to these people. So we spent 6 years interviewing active fighters in Syria and Iraq. And now I'm spending quite a bit of time interviewing former neo-Nazis as well. So I come at it kind of trying to understand from their perspective how they got involved in these movements and how they left.
Great, thanks very much, Amar. Chris, over to you.
Well, thank you, Victor, and thank you to everybody that's been behind organizing today, and also everybody that's joined us. Welcome. What do I bring to the table? Well, I spent a long time in the armed forces, in the Canadian Armed Forces, 36 years in total. I'm a combat arms officer, an artillery officer, and an air defense officer. So ground-based air defense, shooting down airplanes and helicopters and drones and Patriot systems and all of these things I'm very familiar with. But the latter stages of my career were quite interesting. Also, I would pursue a PhD where I focused on civil-military relations in the developing world, and also found myself in Afghanistan for a year at our embassy there as the deputy military attaché, which gave me a really wonderful opportunity to travel around and see things, not to be confined into a particular space where I couldn't get out and take a look at what was happening. I was quite free to travel. So that was a bonus. And from there, I came home and I learned to speak Turkish before being sent to Turkey in 2011 as our defense attaché. Now, I was also cross-accredited to Azerbaijan and Georgia and Turkmenistan, but I also had to keep my eye on Iran, Iraq, and of course, Syria, because it was the height of the Arab Spring. And I was front and center on that Syrian border as we watched all of the issues that were coming about because of the Syrian civil war. So when we speak about refugees flowing into Europe, I saw that happening in front of my own eyes. When we talk about the rise of ISIS, I saw much of that happening also with my own eyes on that border. So since I've come back, I've continued teaching geopolitical courses for the Canadian Forces College, for the Royal Military College, and I do a lot of commentary on the Middle East for all sorts of media outlets and so forth. So I like to think that I bring that being on the ground and seeing this all happening, and also the academic side as well. Thank you.
Excellent, Chris. Thanks very much. Great to have you. And Carole, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me today, and all the participants, even though we can't see you. So what I bring to the table, first of all, I'm a lawyer. I have to confess that right up front. I teach international law and international human rights. I practiced law for 5 years, and then my husband and I moved to Hong Kong in 1989, and that's when I commenced my teaching career. And we made the mistake of telling our parents that we were going to Hong Kong for 1 3-year contract, as many expatriates do. And we stayed for 17 years and raised our son there, much to the annoyance of our parents. It was just frankly way too interesting to leave. Hong Kong is a fascinating city, and I am still a permanent resident of Hong Kong. And until COVID, I went back at least 2, often 3 or 4 times a year for research and teaching and conferences. When I arrived in the summer of 1989, it was just about a month after the Tiananmen Square massacre. So it was a really tense time to start living in Hong Kong. People were very, very upset. When the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in 1984 and ratified in 1985, there was a great deal of nervousness and apprehension, but there was also some hope. And certainly Maggie Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping both went out of their way, I think, to reassure the people of Hong Kong that their way of life would continue after 1997 for at least 50 years until 2047. So the Tiananmen Square massacre was the first, I would say, toss of cold ice water in the faces, because people in Hong Kong who had been hopeful, who had been thinking, oh, China's modernizing, China's becoming more liberal, we're going to help lead China to democracy and human rights. Well, all of a sudden they felt very deflated. And there was also, I would say, that was the first sign that Beijing could see Hong Kong as a possible base for subversion. Because, I mean, there were times when, truthfully, the people of Hong Kong were sending money up to the students in Tiananmen Square, by sending tents up, sending supplies. And there was this sense that Hong Kong was perhaps fermenting unrest in Beijing. And after the crackdown in the summer of 1989, the Hong Kong colonial government was in a very difficult position. On one hand, they had to reassure the people of Hong Kong, they had to keep Hong Kong stable, but on the other hand, they were restricted somewhat in what they could do. And one of the important things that they did do was to introduce a Bill of Rights ordinance in Hong Kong, which was copied almost word for word from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is one of the most important international human rights treaties. And that's a treaty that had been applied to Hong Kong by the British government when the UK ratified the treaty, but it's never been ratified by China. But one of the things that the British negotiators did accomplish in the Sino-British Joint Declaration was they persuaded the Chinese government to promise in the Joint Declaration that the ICCPR and also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also some other important international agreements, such as ILO conventions, would continue to be enforced through the laws of Hong Kong. Some historians say that the Chinese negotiators were sort of tricked, that they just assumed this would be the status quo in Hong Kong. But it really wasn't once the Hong Kong colonial government introduced a domestic Bill of Rights ordinance, because Hong Kong, like the British system, is a dualist system. International law only becomes enforceable in domestic courts when it's incorporated into the domestic legal system. The Bill of Rights ordinance did that. And so in 1991, when the Bill of Rights went fully into force, Hong Kong courts started enforcing essentially the ICCPR in domestic cases. And so that's one of the reasons it became too interesting for me to leave, because it was like a little laboratory of what happens when international law is part of the domestic legal system. And we saw many waves of law reform in Hong Kong. I helped to write one of the first anti-discrimination bills in Hong Kong. We did see many disputes over democracy, which I'll talk about later today. But I have to say the 90s and the early 2000s were largely a period of hope, I would say, in Hong Kong. Of course, the national security law, and even before the national security law, we saw many more violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And the last time I was in Hong Kong, which was in November 2019, during some of the worst of the anti-government protests, there was a lot of violence on the campuses, not so much on the campus that I was staying on, but on many campuses in Hong Kong. And there's a real sense of hopelessness, I would say, among the people. And that has only been exacerbated by the national security law. I do continue to write about Hong Kong. I just published in the end of 2020 my first article on the national security law, and I'm happy to provide it to anyone who might be interested. But I'll speak more about that later. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Carole, and thanks to all of you, Amar, Chris, and Carole. The range of perspectives and experiences that you bring is really breathtaking, and I'm looking so much forward to the three conversations that we're going to have. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the moderating of the first session and the first question to my colleague, Paul Brahmadat, who is the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at the University of Victoria, and he's also a professor in the Department of History. So thanks to you all. I'll see you in a little bit, and Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Victor. It's so lovely to be with you all, and those introductions really got me excited about the kind of conversation I think we're going to have, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be involved at all in conversations with CAPI and CFGS. I think over the years we've had some really, really fruitful collaborations I'm looking forward to today. Just a reminder to the audience members, if you do have a question, we will have a question period, kind of an open format question period toward the end of our session today. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box, the bottom band of your Zoom page, and we will get to them. What we've done is we've tried to organize our conversation around three key questions. We're going to kind of start, I would say local, but I mean, we're going to start with the kind of the American and Canadian context. And then as Victor had outlined previously, we'll kind of go outward from there. So the first question I have, and Amar is going to take the first crack at it, or he'll have the more kind of formal response to the question, and then we'll bring in Carole and Chris. So here's the question. How has the US election and its aftermath affected the trajectory of democracy in the United States and Canada even? For example, we might consider the question of political polarization, right-wing populism, nationalism, things like conspirituality, which I'm sure Amar can tease out, and extremism. So I wonder what you think about the way these 100 or 105 days have had their effect in the kind of North American context.
Sure. So I mean, maybe I'll tackle it with kind of three things that I'm thinking about or worried about going forward, because I think that some of it affects Canada and some of it affects outside of Canada as well. One of them, of course, is kind of the consequences of the end of the war in Syria, the prisoners that we have over there in terms of Canadians who are over there. Just for some background, you know, the Mosul and Raqqa, the kind of administrative capitals, if you will, of ISIS were taken back in July and October of 2017. And about 25 men and women were taken into custody, Canadians, including 26 children, and all of them are still over there. And so I think that political conversation basically came to a halt with COVID. It was a kind of a raging political discussion and policy discussion in the Canadian government for a while, and then the coronavirus kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room, and it was basically shelved. So I think the Americans have brought back their prisoners, but I think our prisoners are still there. And by prisoners, I mean, you know, we're talking 26 children under the age of 12 who are Canadian. And so that policy conversation is going to resurface quite soon, I imagine, because COVID has also impacted the camps. There have been deaths, children have died from malnutrition, et cetera. And so that broader conversation, I think, is still going. Number two, I would say, is kind of, again, what I've loosely termed kind of second and third order consequences of the coronavirus. And part of that is a kind of profound loss of social trust and social trust in government systems, expert systems, loss of trust in science, loss of trust in medicine, loss of trust in journalism, or increased loss of trust in journalism and the media, and this kind of sense that we are living in kind of an increased risk society, if you want to quote, you know, Ulrich Beck, that things happening abroad are having an impact locally and domestically, and we don't really know how to deal with it. And the consequences of that have been, you know, when we were tracking COVID conspiracy theories throughout 2020, in March 2020, with the lockdown and the quarantine, every single conspiracy theory went through the roof on social media, right? If you were watching the frequency of content on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, not to mention the more kind of darker corners of the internet, everything went through the roof. People didn't know how to interpret what was happening, and they immediately turned to conspiratorial thinking, sinister motives of elites, et cetera, to try to explain it. At the same time, of course, you had the Trump administration in power, which I place a lot of what happened in terms of the mainstreaming of conspiratorial thinking at the feet of the Trump administration. Without the Trump administration in power at the time, we wouldn't have had the mainstreaming of a lot of these kinds of thoughts to the extent that we did. He retweeted Alex Jones, he appeared on Alex Jones, he retweeted QAnon content, his team retweeted QAnon content, refused to denounce the Proud Boys or other far-right movements. And we saw kind of a flourishing of basically a loss of trust and a sense of we could kind of understand what's going on. This led to kind of the third thing, which has been quite frustrating, is that the extremism space on the far right in particular has become, I would say, mind-numbingly eclectic and diverse, right? So you have groups like the Oath Keepers, you have groups like 3%ers, the Boogaloo Boys, who are kind of this firearm activist accelerationist group. You have the Proud Boys, and all of these groups basically felt emboldened by the Trump administration and felt like they had a kind of moment in the sun, that they were accepted, they had an ally in the White House. And this kind of started initially with the Charlottesville Tiki Torch protest, right, where the next morning he basically said that there were good people on all sides, etc. That was the kind of first indication for people who study extremism that, oh, we have a kind of different conversation happening in the White House that is probably going to have an impact long term. And sure enough, a lot of these groups felt like they had an ally in the White House, that they at least someone who agreed with some aspects of what they believed in was now in the highest office in the land. And the consequences of that will be felt going forward as well. I mean, regardless of who's in power in the U.S., whether it's the Biden administration or not, the sense that we had an opportunity to really do something and have an impact, and now that opportunity might have been lost, is pushing some of these groups to be at least talk more violently, say more violent things, call for violence. There have been several arrests and plots associated with this as well. And so I think the kind of the loss of mainstream credibility that they had under the Trump administration is producing some level of anger as well. So I would say those three things, kind of what the leftover policy issues about the war in Syria and Iraq, the loss of trust in kind of expert systems, and then the consequences of all of that in terms of conspiracy in the far right and the emboldening that they felt, are the three main things I think the Biden administration is now going to be dealing with, and we'll also be dealing with in Canada.
Do you sense that the last 105 days has created a kind of a change in tone or temperature?
Not really, not in the spaces that I spend too much time, partly because I think they feel they still haven't really gotten over the stop the steal, the election was stolen, the whole thing was rigged argument, right? And so they're still kind of waiting for something to happen, and for Trump to kind of come out and do something. They were really excited about Trump's new social media platform that he was pitching. It ended up being kind of a blog online, which he released yesterday. And so we'll have to wait and see kind of where the dust settles for him, and what he decides, I think, over the next 2 years, whether he's running again in 2024, et cetera, will have an impact on how they respond.
Right. Thanks, Amar. So Chris and Carole, I'd just like to invite you guys back into the conversation, and then we can just get your reflections on some of the themes that Amar picked up. Chris, do you want to start?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, let me start by saying the other day I was driving my nephew to his soccer practice, and I told him that I would be a panelist on this as part of this event, and President Biden would have his State of the Union address, because it was his first 100 days in office. And my 11-year-old nephew looked at me and said, "Has it already been 100 days?" And he knew all about Trump and the U.S. politics. Now, this is an 11-year-old. So I think the impact of having President Trump in Washington is much wider than we sometimes think. Has the world changed, or will it change because President Biden's there? I don't think so, but the signs are that things might get a little bit better. But when I look at these things, I always look at it from a historical perspective. And the fact is, in the United States, things have always been challenging, let's say, when it comes to the political side of the house. And if you go back far enough, you had the anti-war movement that was built around Vietnam. You had race riots, political assassinations in the United States are a factor. We've seen, for example, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And anybody listening here with a good understanding of U.S. politics will recognize when I say Nixon, Iran Contra, Lewinsky, Waco, Timothy McVeigh, you'll all understand that the United States has had many domestic and internal challenges. It always seems to get through them, and Trump was sort of our time, and the United States went through a difficult period, and it was so really comforting in many ways to see President Biden giving his State of the Union address. It won't change the world, but the words that he had to say really sort of changed the course of events, I think. It reminded us that what we had seen over the last four years, this bullying of your traditional allies and the ripping up of international accords, is not leadership. And we expect leadership from the United States. They're not a declining power, despite all these articles that you read. People do look to the United States, and now right-wing movements, wherever they happen to be, I think they've lost their poster child for the moment. They don't have this sort of this person occupying the White House, giving them confidence and energy to go about their business, and now they really have to sort of take stock of where they are. The world, in that sense, has changed just by the removal of one person and the replacement of someone that we can all relate to.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Good point. Thank you. So, Carole, what do you think about the American context, especially if we kind of start there?
Yes, thank you. Well, fortunately, I live in Hawaii, so I missed some of the worst extremes of the Trump administration because I'm so far away from the politics of Washington. But even Hawaii, we have a chapter of the Proud Boys here, and one of them was arrested in connection with the January 6th insurrection. So it's not like we're immune to it. And I think January 6th was a huge wake-up call for a lot of us who thought that the extreme right wing was kind of a small splinter, right, part of the Republican Party. When you see how many people were inspired by and genuinely believed what Trump was feeding them, it was really quite shocking. And I think a lot of us do live in a bubble. We don't watch Fox News. We don't listen to those right-wing radio commentators. We don't really know what a lot of people are hearing and listening to. And so one of the things that I've started doing is forcing myself to watch Fox News at least once a week, turn it on and see what they are saying, because then I think you can kind of understand how people were capable of believing even some pretty outrageous lies about the election. I do think that Biden is the perfect salve for our wounds, in the sense that he is so much the opposite of Donald Trump. He is a calm leader. He doesn't have a huge ego. His moral compass is very, very evident. He's the exact opposite of Trump. And he is, I think, exactly what we need. And I think he's a saint for taking us on right now. I also think that the impeachment trial played a positive role. And I know some people don't think so. They think, why did the Democrats bother with the impeachment trial? You knew you were never going to get enough votes in the Senate. But I believe, first of all, the prosecutors did an excellent job just to get 5 Republicans to vote with them. I mean, that was, I think, quite extraordinary. But not only that, I think it was the evidence that came out in a way that many of us had not seen it connected before, because we were tuning out, many of us, Donald Trump's speeches. We weren't hearing what his followers were being fed. And when the prosecutors put that all together, Trump's speeches and the timing and the responses and the people organizing to go to Washington, it became, I think, more believable. And I think many of us developed actually compassion for some of the people who were foolish enough to go to Washington on January 6th, who actually hugged their kids and said, goodbye, I might die in the fight. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, to prevent the Senate from doing its constitutional duty, I might die in the fight. So what I liked about the impeachment trial is that it put that evidence together in a way that I do think woke up some of the people in the Republican Party. And one of the things about Fox News that I found really interesting was that Fox News kept cutting out during some of the most important parts of the impeachment trial. And I know this because I'd watch it. I watched every moment of the impeachment trial. And when I was watching it on my big screen TV on C-SPAN or something, I would have Fox News on my laptop. And some of the worst moments for Donald Trump, Fox News would suddenly cut to some commentator who would say, oh, I don't think they're doing such a good job. What do you think? And they got complaints about that. People, including yours truly, emailed in and said, why are you cutting out? And the second and third days, they didn't do that so much. They also played word for word without any interruptions Mitch McConnell's speech after the vote. And if you haven't watched it, you should watch a video of it because it's very telling. Mitch McConnell made it very clear that the reason he was voting against impeachment, against conviction, was the constitutional issue. He did not believe, he said, that it was constitutional to try an ex-president for impeachment. But he also made it clear that he thought Trump was guilty of all charges and implied very strongly that there might be a criminal prosecution. And the words he used, the mob was fed lies. The mob was fed lies. That's word for word pretty much what he said. And I think it has had an impact on Republicans. There were a lot of Republicans who didn't particularly like Trump, but they liked some of his policies and they signed on to him and they swallowed hard. They liked the fact that he chose Pence as his vice president. I think after January 6th and after the impeachment trial, their dislike of Trump has come back. I really do. I don't think he has a chance of running for president again. I honestly don't. I think there's a better chance that he'll be bankrupt or in jail. But I do think the key question is what's going to happen to the Republican Party. I mean, you have people like Liz Cheney and Mitch Romney who voted, who clearly supported the impeachment of Donald Trump. And they are taking a lot of criticism now from that side of the Republican Party. So I think that will give us more information about where the conservative side of America is heading politically. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think in both Amar's initial comments and either in Oliver or Victor's reflections early on, there was some reference to the sort of crisis of trust that we see in our culture, whether it's any kind of authority figures, whether it's physicians or journalists or whatever. And that's leading to some fairly strange bedfellows. And I made reference to the concept of conspirituality. And we have a German colleague at our research center who observed how peculiar it is to see kind of neo-Nazis marching in anti-mask rallies beside people who are Reiki masters and yoga, students and so forth, because there is among some folks this peculiar, again, strange bedfellows, this kind of peculiar merger of conspiracies that are, come out of and resonate with the as it were, the right wing, and that those kinds of conspiracies that resonate with the left wing. And I wonder if we can just wrap up with Amara's reflections on that, because we have about a couple minutes left before we go to Oliver's question.
Sure. I think it was largely the COVID conspiracy, COVID pandemic that helped merge a lot of these different conspiratorial communities, right? And so we see it in Toronto. The anti-mask protests will invariably have a QAnon flag. Will invariably have some of these, I don't know what you call it, the kind of spiritual but not religious conspiratorial crowd as well. The kind of pushback to the lockdown, the pushback to quarantine really united a lot of these disparate groups. The fear early on was that particularly the far right, was interested in recruiting from these kinds of pools of people. I haven't seen it happen to the extent that we feared, luckily, but I think there was a real fear that the far right is aware that there's a lot of these disaffected people lying around, and perhaps they can be drawn into their orbit. January 6th was a good example of this as well, because you had a kind of generic MAGA supporters there, you had QAnon supporters there, you had Oath Keepers there, Proud Boys there, and then you had kind of more hardcore far-right elements as well, all marching together, coordinated by some of the groups, but all marching together. And you see this in the online space as well. So I think the QAnon kind of big tent conspiracy plus the COVID pushback to lockdown and quarantine really united at least, I don't know, at a kind of basic level, some of these disparate groups. I don't know if there's going to be kind of, you know, movement across these groups, like a Reiki master is not going to all of a sudden join the Proud Boys or something like that, to the extent that you know, some thought it might happen. But there is a kind of common understanding now that there is a evil, sinister forces at play, and people are lying to us, and is the vaccine really a vaccine, and those kinds of things. And so the agreement on some of those tenets is kind of ideologically diverse, quite surprisingly.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Amar. So now I'm going to turn things over to Oliver Schmidtke, my colleague at the CFGS. Take it away, Oliver.
Thank you very much, and thank you, panelists. I think we could easily continue for another hour to think about the legacy of Trump and whether he has been more kind of reflection of a long-lasting disengagement or disillusionment with established practices and institutions of democracy, or whether we see a great degree of resilience in American democracy. Probably we have to shelve this and gradually move into our second set of questions that address more the international environment and the likely effects that the new Biden administration will have. But formulating the question for this session, let me pick up something that Chris already pointed out. You know, he indicated that America still claims, and if you look around the world, has a form of leadership when it comes to representing Western types of democracy, particular norms, expectations of behavior in the international community. And against this background, in the second part of this session, we would like to get a better understanding of a phenomenon that we see around the world that can be described with the term democratic backslide. We have seen, you know, in spite of some of the optimism of the greater diffusion of democracy into different parts of the world, a real setback. I think with Chris, we started off discussing the Arab Spring and lots of those expectations of democratization. You can also even go to places that are known for very established democracies. Think about Europe and the rise of the extreme right, of authoritarian tendencies, you know, particular countries in Central Eastern Europe, the renewed emphasis on nationalism that directly takes from the playbook of Trumpism that have become far more popular around the world. So in light of this, Chris, you know, let me start with you. You know, I'm wondering whether with the Biden administration and the claim to rebuild democratic alliances, America's back in terms of its leadership, do we see a possible turnaround here, a new support for and strengthening of some of those democracies that have been under pressure lately around the world?
Right. So thank you, Oliver. Will the trends change under the Biden administration? On the surface, I think they will, because as I mentioned before, with Trump not being there, I think that's taken a lot of the energy away from some of the folks we see around the world that have been moving towards a more authoritarian style of governance. But when I look at this particular period of time, it's a snapshot. And if you look at what Freedom House has to say about democratic backsliding, you can get a little bit concerned. But when I look at where we've come from, which is what I want to just focus on right now, it's probably not as bad as we think. And, you know, we have, if we go back 30 years to 1991 with the end of the Cold War, what have we witnessed since the end of the Cold War? Well, the European Union has expanded considerably. NATO has also expanded, and every former member of the Warsaw Pact, except for the Soviet Union / Russia, is a member of NATO. And many of the former Soviet republics are Partnership for Peace members with NATO. So, and we can't forget the former Yugoslavia. Also, many of those newer countries are part of NATO. We've seen this expansion of democratic norms throughout Europe that 30 years ago were not there. And so, yes, we do witness some backsliding right now, but in many respects, I think it should be expected. It's not a perfect road to democracy. There will be pressures. And I have to say that many of the pressures that we are seeing on newer democracies in Europe in particular, and I'm being very heavily Eurocentric right now, and I'm conscious of that, have actually been brought about by our own issues. We've done it to ourselves, and let me talk a little bit about that as well. When I look at the West, and we are always concerned with democratic backsliding, after 9/11, of course, we went into Afghanistan in 2001, and that was quickly followed up by the United States and England or the United Kingdom and Poland leading the way into Iraq in 2003. We became heavily invested in the Middle East, while at the same time we saw in 2008, 2009, an economic crisis shake the world. And we all remember what was happening in Greece at that particular time. And on top of that, the Arab Spring came. And there was a decision by many countries in the West, including Canada, to become involved in Libya on what was sort of a human security mission, but it quickly morphed into a removal of the Gaddafi government. And that led to our first refugee crisis. I think most of us now have probably forgotten about the number of people that were fleeing across the Mediterranean into Southern Europe. But we weren't done. We also decided to topple the Syrian government. It failed. But what it did do is it produced incredible destruction, lives being lost. I mean, it's a massive failure on the part of the West, what happened in Syria, and people paid the price. But Europe paid the price also, because suddenly they have refugees pouring into Southern Europe and then eventually into Germany. And this then create some of the conditions that we are seeing today. So when we talk about populism and right-wing extremism, where should the finger be pointed? I'm fully agree that having people in charge like Gaddafi and Assad and others is not what you'd like to see. But when you topple regimes in the Middle East but have no plan B, don't complain when you start getting refugees showing up on your doorstep and it starts to undermine your own political situation. So that's what I would say there. We can't forget, of course, Brexit, COVID-19, and other things that are happening even now, which will impact the Biden administration, such as the pullout of Afghanistan. This is going to happen. And there's every reason for America to end their entanglements in places like Afghanistan. But all I can say is that that's Canada and other countries throughout Europe, are going to have to prepare for a new wave of refugees, which will also then create issues as well. Countries like Turkey, for example, have 3.6 million Syrian refugees, 400,000 Afghan refugees already. There'll be great pressure on Turkey as well. So when I look at the current situation, there is a recession, if you like, in terms of democracy in places such as Europe. There's a crisis in confidence in Europe, brought about by economic issues, the refugee issues, and one might see some of those issues being resolved in the near future, but But I think the Biden administration, all of Europe, they'll still need to contend with and manage these issues. Things have not changed, and they arguably won't change that much. You know, if you Google international crises 2020, 2021, you're going to see the same sorts of things that you saw 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And I'm talking about, you know, Lebanon and Yemen, Iran, North Korea, and so forth. The Biden administration will have to, of course, tackle every single one of these. But I think on the bright side, you know, America's not led any longer by a disruptive president, you know, who really turned vindictiveness into an art form, a diplomatic art form. It was quite horrible to see what was coming out of the White House. And so with the Biden administration there should be a degree of leveling, and democratic forces around the world should take some comfort in knowing that there's a good chance now the United States will have your back. They won't be able to solve all the problems in the world. They won't. But we've needed to rely on the United States for decades, and we will have to in the future. And it's just, I think, better that we've seen this change in the White House.
Thank you very much, Chris. And it's great to put this into historic perspective as well, you know, to be aware of, you know, looking at those trends and, you know, the possibility of changing those. Carole, could I invite you to share your reflections on what we can expect in terms of the state of democracy globally and the possible impact an incoming or by now established Biden administration has? Carole, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I didn't unmute. I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about the state of democracy globally. I think those places that have become more authoritarian are going to remain more authoritarian for some time. I am more optimistic about the role that the United States can play under Biden's leadership. I do think we will see a much more level-headed, compassionate, rational foreign policy. But that doesn't answer the question of what does it mean to say we have your back, to use Chris's words. I think part of the problem with advocating for democracy and human rights around the world is that inevitably you do raise hopes among the people who do not enjoy democracy and human rights. And in this globalized world where everyone can connect over the internet, it is only natural for opposition groups who are demonstrating for more democracy and more human rights in their country to expect support from the democratic nations, particularly those that are very powerful. So then what do you do when they're crushed? And this leads to the whole debate about intervention and aid for opposition groups. And I do think the lawyers bear some responsibility because we have a lot to do with the drafting of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which not everyone may be aware of, but the responsibility to protect, maybe doctrine is too strong of a word because I'm not sure it's really binding in international law yet, but it arose out of the guilt that the international community felt over the failure to prevent genocide in Rwanda. And Kofi Annan asked the international community to deal with this question. You know, what should the international community do to intervene to prevent really horrific human rights violations like this? And the Canadian government sponsored a commission that came up with this report, Responsibility to Protect, and they tried to conceptualize this not in the old way of a right to intervene, which is the way humanitarian intervention used to be described, but more as a duty, a responsibility to protect. But it does have some very important precautionary principles. And it does state very clearly that an intervention should always be approved by the UN Security Council. And it's only when the Security Council fails to act, which it often does because one permanent member or another vetoes a resolution, that then regional organizations or maybe the General Assembly under its Uniting for Peace resolution might be able to act. But the other important safeguard in that doctrine, which people often forget about, is it says you really shouldn't intervene unless you're going to make the situation better. And sometimes that's not possible. And I think Libya is a perfect example where the Security Council did authorize the no-fly zone. I think a lot of people think didn't make things better at all, right? So I think while I do expect far better foreign policy by Joe Biden, I think it will be primarily in the form of soft diplomacy, rejoining multilateral efforts to promote democracy, being more active in the UN, in UN human rights bodies, which the Trump administration was pulling away from. I don't think that we can fix a lot of the democratic deficits that there are in the world. And we can try to use our economic and geopolitical influence, but let's face it, China has a lot of geopolitical influence, and I'll be speaking about that later, and they are rewarding precisely the opposite model of governance. So that's why, although I am very relieved to have Joe Biden at the helm, and I think our foreign policy will be much better for the democratic nations, I'm not sure that we should overestimate what we can do or what any democratic nation can do for people who are living under authoritarian rule.
Thank you very much, Carole. Amar, over to you.
I mean, I come at this a little bit differently. So I think what I see is happening, I guess, in several of the countries that I watch is what Stanley Tambaya, the anthropologist, called way back in the day a kind of majority with a minority complex. And so he kind of touched on this idea that certain communities in power, and he was largely referring to Sri Lanka in his own writings, but the majority community, which has all the structural power, is the majority community when you talk about ethnic background, religious background, etc. Still somehow has developed a kind of sense of cultural loss, a sense of threat, a sense of being under threat, a sense that certain minorities within your country are kind of sinister fifth column types who are, secretly plotting against the majority community, etc. And so that kind of trend is now happening, I think, a lot more in countries like, we've seen it in India with the Hindutva movement. We've seen it in Myanmar with the 969 movement. We've seen it with identity movements in Europe who talk about the loss of Western culture, the loss of white identity, the great replacement, white genocide, etc. And we are continuing to see it in places like Sri Lanka as well. This sense that somehow, even though you're the majority and for all intents and purposes have all the structural benefits, that's still fragile, that still could be lost at any moment. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in a lot of these countries, the threat, the other, is identified as the Muslim community, right? Whether you're talking about the Hindutva groups in India, Myanmar with the Rohingya, with the Sri Lankan Muslim community, and definitely in Western Europe with the kind of post-Syrian revolution refugee crisis. In every one of these communities where they see the majority under threat, it's often the threat is coded as Muslim, and so I think that's one of the fault lines that we're going to be seeing going forward that I'm quite worried about, and I think we're less prepared to deal with that because, for all the reasons that Carole stated, these are not sub-state actors, these are not non-state actors, these are governments, and these are people in power, and we don't have a great track record dealing with people in power and holding them to account. And so, much of these governments continue to draw on kind of mythical utopian pasts to make their argument, utopian futures that they're fighting towards, and they tend to kind of erase all historical nuances as most nationalisms do, or ethno-nationalisms do. And so, I think we're going to have a hard time dealing with some of these countries who feel somehow the minorities within their country are out to get them, I guess. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Amar. It's fascinating to think about it, again, going back to Chris' historical perspective, that ethno-nationalism that we thought maybe was a force of the 19th, maybe early 20th century has made such a comeback in the 21st century as a formative political ideology, that we see playing out, right? The cultural conflicts and religious conflicts that some have predicted would shape foreign policy, they come, they have taken hold and redefined very much, the fight for also democratic rights, human rights, and the international community. I think, I'm looking at my watch, we have 1 minute left, maybe, transitioning over, Chris, very quickly back to you. What do you think will be Biden's main preoccupation in foreign policy? What crisis will he primarily have to deal with in his first year or two? Do you already see, something that, you mentioned the refugees, that will be more closer to home, the border issue, or, if you look around, what is your prediction about what will keep this new Biden administration busy?
Well, first of all, I don't know how he would sleep at night because he's got so many issues on the table every moment. I think the one that we're all watching right now is simply Afghanistan, because there's a lot on the table there. What is the future going to be for the people of Afghanistan? And if it gets ugly, the pressure on the United States to do something will ramp up incredibly. So I'd say that was probably one, but there are many more files that are needed to be handled in the White House, that's for sure.
Thank you. And now we gradually move over to Asia. And, with this, I would like to invite Victor Ramraj back as our moderator for the last section of our discussion today.
Thanks very much, Oliver. And speaking of files that the Biden administration is having to deal with, one of the big ones is clearly the U.S.-China relationship, which, as we all know, has been a major focal point in global politics on many different measures. In fact, I was just thinking that one of my last trips before COVID was to Hong Kong in the summer of 2019. And I remember being in a hotel room looking down over the street at a sea of protesters in Hong Kong. And we can all sort of cast our minds back to that period of protest in Hong Kong. And certainly the U.S.-China relationship is complicated in a number of ways, but certainly the legal and political developments and the challenges for democratic institutions and practices in Hong Kong and the wider region is at the core of many of these issues. So I'm going to invite Carole to start off on the question as we presented it, which collect some of these points, and to tell us about the critical developments in the China-U.S.-Hong Kong relationship and the broader region, and how the Biden administration is appearing to be handling them. So Carole, over to you to start us off.
Thank you very much. I have prepared some remarks on 6 issues that I think are critical. And the last one on the list is actually Hong Kong, even though it's the one that's probably dearest to my heart, being a Hong Kong resident. But the 6 issues, not necessarily in the order of importance, but the 6 issues that I've identified are Taiwan, the South China Sea, trade disputes, and the trade war that Trump started with China, intellectual property and the perceived threat of American intellectual property by Chinese companies, human rights generally, including the persecution of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minority groups in mainland China, and then 6, the violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the crackdown on human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. So that's a lot to talk about, and I will try to make sure that I keep my remarks within time. In short, for some of these issues, President Biden really only has limited wiggle room. And the reason I say that is that the distrust of China in the US is one issue that the Republicans and the Democrats agree on. It's very much a bipartisan view. And they approach it in different ways often, but it is still a very strong feeling. And there's no question that Donald Trump profited from the idea that he was finally getting tough on China. A lot of people felt that Obama's administration and other previous administrations had been too, quote, soft on China, and that he was fixing that. And he gained a lot of political leverage from that. And so if President Biden changes his approach to China, and I think he will, but it will have to be subtle and gradual, I think. And there are some issues on which I really don't think he will change the policy that much. But I do think Biden will bring, again, a very different approach. It will be pragmatic. It will be honest, in the sense that I think Trump outright misled a lot of his supporters, particularly with respect to what he could do with the trade war with China. And I think he will be guided more by international law and by a real moral compass. And so I think it will be a better policy overall, but I don't think we can expect miracles. To start with Taiwan, a lot of people don't know this, but one country, two systems, the model of autonomy that Hong Kong and Macau are supposed to be governed under, was originally planned for Taiwan. It was put into Article 31 of China's constitution with the idea that Taiwan would someday voluntarily agree to rejoin mainland China, but be allowed to keep their separate legal system, their separate economic system. And at one point when relations were a little friendlier, there was even some discussion of Taiwan being offered one country, two systems plus, and the plus was you'd have your own military still, right? I don't think that ever went too far in the discussions, but there were some, in the track to diplomacy, there was some discussion of that. And of course, that would be a much higher degree of autonomy than Hong Kong or Macau have, because they have never had their own military. You know, when the British sailed out of Hong Kong, the PLA came in. Right? Now, when I first moved to Hong Kong in the 1990s, people in Hong Kong who were positive about one country, two systems would often say, Taiwan is our insurance policy. Beijing will want one country, two systems to work. They will want Hong Kong people to be happy because they want to encourage Taiwan to come back peacefully, right? Well, obviously that didn't work out so well. And as I'll discuss later, it really is primarily over the conflicts, over the very vague language in the Joint Declaration on Democracy, which led both sides interpreting it the way they wanted it to, and it's led to so many conflicts. So where are we now with Taiwan, now that it's very clear that one country, two systems hasn't worked? It hasn't made the people of Hong Kong happy. The people of Macau it's much more stable there, but the people of Macau never really exercised the kind of autonomy that Hong Kong people were accustomed to. So Taiwan is now basically being intimidated. I mean, the strategy is no longer luring Taiwan back with promises of a high degree of autonomy. It's much more, you're eventually going to have no choice. We will eventually force you to come back, either through economic and geopolitical pressures or perhaps through outright military intervention. So for the United States, our policy has traditionally been one that scholars call strategic ambiguity with respect to Taiwan. And by that, I mean, we always say that we oppose any reunification by force, but we respect the one China policy, right? We don't have official relations with Taiwan. And the reason for that strategic ambiguity is that on one hand, we don't want Taiwan to be so comfortable, so assured that we are going to defend Taiwan that it might declare independence, which would certainly spark a war. But on the other hand, we don't want China to be so sure that we wouldn't defend Taiwan that it will militarily invade Taiwan. And so the hope was that this strategic ambiguity could keep the status quo long enough so that maybe eventually Chinese government would change, hope of hopes, or there would be some possibility of a reconciliation that wasn't forced, but that was in fact voluntary. Now, Trump threw that strategic ambiguity a little bit on its ear when he picked up the phone and talked to Taiwan's president, right? Very early on in his administration. And it created a whole new sense of the United States is very pro-Taiwan. And that was, I think, in some ways, even more challenging to Beijing than all the trade sanctions, because territory means so much to Beijing. Now, what do we expect from Biden? I think we absolutely have to support Taiwan. And in some ways, Taiwan's right to claim self-determination and autonomy is even stronger than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And that's because Taiwan is now a functioning democracy with a very high level of respect for human rights. And the Taiwan government has been very strategic about this. They have tried to ratify human rights treaties, but when they send their notice of ratification to the UN sends it back and says, no, you're not a member, you can't do it. And then their domestic parliament passes a law, their legislature passes a law incorporating the treaty into their domestic law, and they invite international experts to come and do reviews, the same kind of reviews that they would go through if they could go to Geneva and report. And so over time, Taiwan has really become the guiding light for human rights and democracy in East Asia. So is the international community going to stand back and let them be taken over by an authoritarian regime? And that's what I mean when the moral claim to be defended is really very strong. So I think that Biden will probably return a little bit more to the careful diplomacy. I think he will definitely return more to the language of we respect the one China policy, but we'll still be very strong on defending Taiwan. And I must say, I am worried about Taiwan. I think it's very possible that Xi Jinping may make a move on Taiwan. I don't think right now, because I think Xi Jinping feels that he's achieved enough for his nationalism by cracking down on Hong Kong, right? And with his exploits in the South China Sea and now space. But at some point, if Xi Jinping thinks he needs something to build up his reputation and to make him even more famous than Deng Xiaoping and maybe even more famous than Mao in Chinese history, I don't think he'd hesitate to strike Taiwan if he thought that he could win. So Taiwan is a big worry in my mind. South China Sea is also a very scary place. I won't say as much about that, but I think we all know when China built the artificial islands, they said, don't worry, they'll never be military. Well, now they're militarized. We are seeing, I think, an interesting shift in the region in the sense that Duterte from the Philippines was initially cozying up to Xi Jinping and was basically not seeking to enforce the Philippines' judgment in the South China Sea dispute. But now he's not so sure, and he's not terribly happy about these armed fishing boats that are hanging out in the South China Sea. I think that there's a real possibility of an armed conflict someday in the South China Sea, and it may be a conflict between drones because submarines are going to eventually be largely replaced, I think, by these unmanned submersibles. They're basically submarines that can be commanded from a mothership and eventually maybe even can be completely autonomous. And if you have lots of those in the South China Sea without actual people on them, I think there's more possibility that they might start shooting at each other. So I think that is very, very worrying. Issues, but I don't think actually that the Biden administration's approach to the South China Sea will be much different, other than because I think Biden is much better about building up coalitions and allies. I think it will be much more of a multilateral approach rather than a unilateral approach. Trade and intellectual property. Trade, I think, was used by Trump as a weapon, a political weapon for himself. I think he actively misled his supporters. He really made them think that the reason Americans weren't earning as much in factories as they used to earn was because China was stealing their jobs. The truth is that a lot of the change in the labor market is due to automation. Right? More jobs are being lost to automation than they are to foreign competitors or economic globalization. And I think Hillary Clinton, one of the reasons she lost the election, I think she wasn't willing to tell people that I'm going to bring back all your jobs. I remember her saying actually in a forum or a debate with Trump, I can't promise to bring those jobs back. They're not necessarily coming back, but Trump promised it and people believed him. And I think now they're not so sure that he was right about that. I think Biden's approach to trade disputes will eventually be much different than Trump's, but I think that he will move very slowly. IP, on the other hand, intellectual property, I think we're going to see a continuation of very strong US assertion that China's been stealing intellectual property, and they're going to be, at least the discourse, I don't know about the actions, but the discourse will continue to be very strong. I'm short on time, so I'm going to move over to issues 5 and 6, which were human rights generally in China and the Hong Kong issue. In the CBS 60 Minutes interview, the Secretary of State was asked about China's repression of Muslim minority populations in China and the decision to call it a genocide against the Uyghurs. And this was somewhat controversial. The Trump administration threw it out there in the last day, I think, of the Trump administration, suddenly said this is a genocide. I think in a way they thought they were sort of laying some sort of trap for Biden, because if Biden didn't continue, but well, then now you're soft on China, right? And you're not really protecting human rights. The reason it's a tricky issue is that the Genocide Convention, which is the legal definition of genocide in international law, doesn't include cultural genocide. You have to prove that there is an intent to destroy the group as such. That's not how laypersons often think of genocide. They think of it as including cultural genocide, but legally under international law, it doesn't. And so even among China scholars, there's a huge debate about whether the treatment of the Uyghurs amounts to genocide. To me, I think it's more of a technical issue. It at least amounts to crimes against humanity, right? And so does it matter that much? But the term genocide is a very powerful one. And the Biden administration has apparently decided to continue that label and to defend it. And to some extent they can, because there is evidence of forced sterilization, which is one of the means specified in the Genocide Convention, in an attempt to restrict births within the group. But what's really happening to the Uyghur people probably more amounts to very severe abuses of human rights, perhaps not with the intent to actually destroy the group. It's just to make the group behave exactly the way the Chinese Communist Party wants it to behave. And then finally, Hong Kong. I think President Trump played a horrible role with respect to Hong Kong. He really did use it, I think, as a way to drum up a lot of anti-China feeling. And I think this is a really perfect example of a president holding out for some very unwise, very young protesters, the hope that somehow Trump was going to do something for him. And the last time I was in Hong Kong was in November 2019. I was on Hong Kong U's campus. I was staying in the guest house there where I used to teach. And all of my events and class observations were canceled because the students had taken over the campus. So I spent 10 days walking around the campus talking to students. And every now and then I'd see one with a Trump hat on. And I'd say, really? Do you really support Donald Trump? And they'd say, oh, yes, because he doesn't like Xi Jinping. And then you started seeing occasionally, and this was just a tiny percentage of the protesters in Hong Kong, people waving American flags and waving Trump flags in the protests. So although when you look down, Vicar, and you saw in the summer of 2019 this sea of peaceful protesters, what you were seeing was the traditional Hong Kong protests. I've marched in them many times myself, protesting for democracy, protesting against a certain proposal. Those protests were always peaceful. There was never even a window broken, right? Let alone fires started. But by late fall 2019, things had changed. And even though it was a very small percentage of people, some people really were engaging in violent behavior, and many more were engaging in vandalism, ripping up campuses. I mean, I was kind of in tears to see the state of the campus that I used to teach at. And I think I have to wonder what was going on there. At first, I was convinced that there were provocateurs being sent in to make the protesters violent so that China would have an excuse to crack down. But after talking to a lot of the students, I'm not so sure that that's true. I mean, they are all very sweet and nice to me, but when they pull over their masks and pile up the bricks they'd ripped out and hang them over 10 stories, getting ready to dump them on the police, it was pretty scary. And on my former campus, they didn't, partly because they were talked down by a lot of very wise deans who operated as kind of mediators. But the sad thing is that tiny percentage of people who maybe were partly emboldened by Trump's discourse, they did do things that were very unwise. And they made the Hong Kong issue a nationalism issue for China. And so I bet if you could do an honest poll of the people of the People's Republic of China, most of them support the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. They really felt that their territory was going to be taken away from them. And the national security law is horrible. The article that I just published on it is called The Disappearing Firewall. And what I mean by that is, under One Country, Two Systems, there was supposed to be a legal firewall between Hong Kong and mainland China. The highest court in Hong Kong is the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. There were no appeals to mainland China. You could not be extradited over the border to mainland China. That's what the 2019 protests were about, because Carrie Lam was proposing a case-by-case form of extradition. What the Hong Kong people got in the end is so much worse than that proposal, because now under the national security law, Beijing can assume jurisdiction over a case without even an extradition hearing. They don't call it extradition, but essentially they can assume jurisdiction over a case. The offenses, the specific offenses of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces are bad enough. But what's really bad are the new security institutions. So now we have mainland Chinese security personnel operating for the first time legally in Hong Kong. We knew occasionally they came across the border without any official powers, right? We do know that at least one bookseller was kidnapped from Hong Kong. But what we have now is legal authority under a national law for mainland Chinese security personnel to operate in Hong Kong. And my interpretation of the law is they are not subject to the jurisdiction of Hong Kong law as long as they're acting in their official duties. So I put a hypothetical out to all of my former colleagues at Hong Kong U, and I said, the way I read the law, it sounds to me that if a member of the Chinese security personnel who are now stationed in Hong Kong, if they pick me up on the streets of Hong Kong and bundle me into the trunk of a car and start driving away, there is nothing Hong Kong police can do about it as long as they flash their ID. And they all said, that's right. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen. And my hope is that Beijing may step back a little bit. I mean, now that they have essentially crushed the democracy movement, they're remaking the legislature in Hong Kong so that the pan-democrats really will not be able to run. I'm hoping that maybe they'll step back and at least allow civil liberties to exist in a modified form in Hong Kong. I don't agree that Hong Kong is just like any other city in mainland China yet. At this point, you still do have a high degree of freedom of expression, academic freedom. The freedom of the press is still being practiced in Hong Kong, albeit with this shadow of the national security law. But I think there's a real question of how it's going to play out. The one good thing about the law is it does say that the ICCPR will continue to apply in Hong Kong. And the courts have said that this means they should interpret any vague language in the law so as to comply with the ICCPR. Now, the National People's Congress Standing Committee has the overriding power to issue a legislative interpretation if they want, so they could override what the Hong Kong courts do. But we just don't know yet how these individual cases will play out. So with respect to Biden, to conclude, I think Biden's approach to Hong Kong is, again, I think it will be more disciplined than the approach of Donald Trump. I think they'll be more careful about what they say. But I checked the other day, and all the sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration are still there. And indeed, now there are more officials, including officials in Hong Kong, who are being sanctioned as a result of the Hong Kong Autonomy Act in the United States. So I think it's an open question as to whether that relationship will be repaired at all. It may be that over time, Hong Kong will simply become more and more integrated with mainland China. And the sad thing is that the economic sanctions and the trade sanctions might just accelerate that integration, because the Trump administration might have thought they were punishing China, but actually it's the people of Hong Kong who will be hurt by any trade sanctions. And so that they may be compelled simply to integrate economically faster and faster with mainland China. So I'll conclude there. I hope I didn't go over time.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Carole. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Chris and Amar for some quick responses before we shift to the Q&A session. But thank you for sort of putting those 6 challenges on the table. And I'm not sure, Chris, if this is where you want to go, but I do want to ask you if you're now convinced that of all of the files that the Biden administration has to deal with, that Carole has convinced you that the most challenging file is going to be the U.S.-China relationship. And Amar, I'm curious about when you think about some of the description of some of the backsliding in Hong Kong and some of the other human rights challenges, whether any of that sort of resonates and maybe ricochets back to what's going on domestically in the United States. So you can take me up on those questions or take it in a different direction. So Chris, over to you first.
Yeah, so after Carole's talk there, I'm ready to change my focus over to Taiwan from Afghanistan. And you can bet this is happening in the White House on a daily basis. You know, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan said, you know, somebody said to him, what drives you every day? Events, my dear boy, events. And so this is something that will drive the White House on any given day. What I will quickly point out when it comes to China, and I know that GDP and defense budgets are not the ultimate measure of where things are in the world, but one of the things that we do forget is that China has no friends, whereas America does. And if you add up the defense budgets of the United States and all of those countries that work with the United States so closely, so I'm talking Taiwan and South Korea, Japan, Canada, we're talking like $1 trillion being spent on defense. And China is only at about a quarter of that amount. And what we also have to remember, of course, is the Chinese military is, one, focused on its own domestic issues. So it has a very internal look. Yes, it has flashy aircraft carriers and shows up with fancy equipment, but it also has an incredibly important domestic focus, which takes a lot of that energy from them. And more importantly, and perhaps not the best thing to say, but they have no combat experience. And this is really important. They just have not been involved in the world to the degree that the United States and others have had, for better and for worse, I should add. But these are also factors that play into the China debate, which we sometimes don't even think about. But China, I think, is really important. They don't have any friends that they can call on, not like the United States.
Thanks, Chris. Amar?
Yeah, I mean, just 2 quick things, I guess. One, if any of you saw the kind of, his first speech to Congress, he did spend quite a bit of time on China. And what was interesting about that is, I think it, speaking of domestic politics, we have to remember, Trump and Giuliani accused Biden's son of receiving $1.5 billion from the Chinese government. They called on China to investigate the Bidens during the election campaign. And so I think Biden is going to be using his policy position or his policy posture towards China to try to bring about some domestic bipartisanship as well, right? Especially around things like climate, which he explicitly mentioned during the speech. So that's kind of the good news maybe of things. And I think the bad news, of course, and I'm surprised it hasn't been mentioned so far, is the cyber attacks. And there's a real concern, I think, with China, that there's kind of ongoing hacking of companies in Taiwan. They're stealing of military capabilities. They're stealing of intellectual property, cyber espionage, not only aimed at the U.S. and Canada, but also the entire Five Eyes network that we're a part of. with companies. They have kind of these hacking collectives called, named like Black Tech and the amazingly titled Mustang Panda, who are kind of behind some of these hacking of social media companies and things like that. So I think in between that, we're going to have to deal with how to answer back to that, some of that stuff as well. So.
Great, thanks, Amar. I think I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to hand things over to Paul for a last round of Q&A and any other comments that you might have. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, folks. I'm not sure how strict Zoom is going to be on the cutoff time. I think we're scheduled to go till 6:30, and hopefully we can go a couple minutes over. But I know everyone's got to get to their dinners. But there's some very good questions from Rod Dobell and Sudhir Jain, and I'm going to kind of distill them. Sometimes this is perhaps inaccurately sourced, that Winston Churchill is said to have said, Americans always make the right decision. They just have to exhaust every other option first. And so I want to come back to an observation that both Carole and Chris made about the current state of democracy, right? So there is a kind of, among, I would say, progressive, educated, cosmopolitan, left-leaning folks, a great sense of relief that Trump is gone, right? And yet, Carole, you mentioned that you weren't all that optimistic about the fate of, or the state of democracy. Chris seemed to be a bit more optimistic. So many of us, although we're relieved that Trump is gone, I wonder about the state of democratic norms and what the future holds for democracy, whether we're looking at Europe and the rise of a particular kind of populism, or whether we're looking at the strong xenophobic nativism that we see in the United States. I just wonder what your kind of final remarks are on that question. In some sense, this is growing out of observations made by both Rod and Sudhir in their questions.
I'll maybe start that quickly. I think there's definitely happiness, I guess, that Trump is gone on multiple fronts. But if the polling is to be believed, there's a good chunk of Republicans. I think the recent Reuters poll put it at 50% or slightly over 50% of Republicans believe that Biden is not a legitimate president, right? And that there is a kind of ongoing distrust of what happened in the election, and so Biden's going to have to deal with that. I mean, it's a significant segment of the population who believes that he's there, by chance or illegally, and so he's going to have to rally support at a bipartisan level in some form. And I think some of that will have to do with how Trump responds along the way, as I've mentioned. So.
Chris, you were the optimist of the bunch, and you had some sense of the resilience of American democracy.
Yeah, I do believe that's the case. America has a lot to answer for, though, and perhaps not so much Trump. You have to look at what President Obama did in Libya, what President Obama did in Syria. It's a great example where the Syrian opposition found out that America didn't have their back, even though that they had been basically told or given the idea that America would be behind them. So many red lines were crossed. I think there's no ink left in red pens in Washington and in places like Ankara, for example. So it's not perfect. It's not perfect. Much of the xenophobia and all that we see in Europe has come about because of meddling in the Middle East that has created the conditions that people are wrestling with right now. It's not the only reason, but it's been a big one. And so we have a lot to answer for in the West itself. But I still come back to the fact that when you have someone steering the ship in Washington that has a sound view of the world, that it's not telling Turkey because they're unhappy with them that they're going to destroy their economy in a Twitter tweet. When you're stepping away from that, I think you have to be optimistic that the United States will be there to support people who find themselves, whether it's in Belarus or in Myanmar, facing the worst sorts of situations, that although the United States can't rush in with its military might, that they are trying in other ways to support you and push the forces of democracy incrementally. Perhaps it'll take a long time, perhaps. But look, as I said, historically, we've come a long way when it comes to democracy in Europe alone. if you compare to what it was 30 years ago. So perspective. Much happier that Biden is steering the ship.
Carole?
Yes, thank you. I think I want to go back to something that I think Chris said about China. He said China has no friends, and that may be true, but China has a lot of influence. I mean, there have been several times when governments like the British government have introduced resolutions in the UN Human Rights Council to condemn China. For example, the National Security Law for the treatment of Uyghurs, and China has muscled up more votes defending it. Now, when I was writing my article, I looked into which countries voted in favor of China, and almost all of them are rated not free or only partly free, or they owe big debts to China. They're part of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So they may not have friends, but they have a lot of power. So I do think that a lot of governments around the world are looking at China and saying, whoa, authoritarianism seems to work pretty well, right? And so I think to a large extent, the world will see maybe in 30, 40 years where China is. I think China has a lot of socioeconomic problems, an aging population, great inequality, environmental problems, and it may turn out that the authoritarian regime in China doesn't look so rosy at 50 years from now. But right now, there are a whole lot of people around the world who are saying that model looks pretty good compared to, whoa, how messy democracy got in the United States, right, under the Donald Trump rule. So I think it's too early to say, really. I would like to note, though, that even though some of these Reuters polls show that a certain percentage of Republicans still think that Biden wasn't legitimately elected, on the other hand, a poll of the approval rating for his speech the other day was very high across the United States, across all political parties. I think most of the Americans who supported Trump are pretty pragmatic. And if the economy improves and they see that the pandemic is being dealt with in a more competent manner, I think actually gradually they're going to become quite supportive of Biden, or at least not so supportive of Trump. And finally, I'd like to say that, there are a lot of prosecutors looking into the Trump organization right now, and prosecutors, their political careers depend on success of their prosecutions. And I actually think there's a fairly good chance that Trump or some of his very close associates like Giuliani may wind up convicted of crimes before this is all over. And that could also have a big impact in the United States. Someone in the QA said, isn't it risky for the world, for the US to commit to continuing to have your back when it comes to Taiwan? And I do want to answer that. Yes, I agree. But that's what I meant by strategic ambiguity. I think that the United States has traditionally tried to be a little ambiguous about that because they don't want Taiwan to think that it can up and declare independence. I think the US wants the status quo because we can't imagine a better outcome at the moment. On the other hand, it would be very difficult, I think, morally and politically for the United States not to defend Taiwan if China actually invades. I hope that doesn't happen, and I don't expect it to happen in the near future, but in the long term, I think it's very possible.
So there's one last question I want to pose. It's a very good one from Kira Bandy, and I want to pose it as a final question and give you a couple sentences to answer. Because it's a very lovely way to end, I think. So looking forward, what are the panelists' ideas in terms of specific strategies to reinforce the shaken trust in our systems or to reinforce democracy itself? So I'll just give you a couple sentences each. So you get to choose, if you had a wand to wave, how you would address the wide range of issues we've all brought to the table today. So why don't we go Carole, Chris, and we'll end with Amar.
Very easy, invest in public education. I do think the United States, we have failed to properly fund our public schools, and it's one of the reasons that so many people were so easily misled by Donald Trump and his discourse.
Thank you.
I just think the quality of public education has gone way down and we have to build it up again.
Okay, thanks. Chris?
A strong civil society, a knowledgeable civil society, and that's one of the things that the Canadian International Council tries to do.
Oh, what a good and a very good plug at the very end. Nicely done.
Yeah, I would underscore the last 2 points, and I would say I think the U.S. has a particularly unique ability to politicize everything, and in a very polarized and intense way. The politics in the U.S. is very intense at all times, and I think finding ways to to kind of turn down the temperature, I think, is an important step forward, and part of that has to do with digital literacy, social media literacy, public education, and things of that sort. So.
Thanks very much, Amar. So now it falls to me to thank everybody, to thank the panelists, Carole, Chris, and Amar, to thank my friends and colleagues, Oliver and Victor, for joining together to have this wonderful conversation, to thank as well Stephanie Rilke, Jody Walsh, Rachel Brown, and Jonathan Woods for helping to make all of this actually happen. Of course, we don't get to do this by ourselves. We really need colleagues to help us think through and deal with the technical as well as substantive questions. And thanks very much for so many of you for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. I think this is a very good model for how our three centers, which we all have kind of overlapping sets of interests, and we also have large networks that we can, we can bring together to have conversations about things that I think are of tremendous political and public interest. So I hope you'll all stay tuned to our respective websites for news on future collaborations, and look forward to seeing you all in the virtual world, or perhaps by September in the real world. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.